So, welcome everyone. I want to talk. My comments this morning are called "Non Harming: The Precept We Can't Keep." And I want to spend some time on that this morning because it's a challenging topic. And, it's this is one of the five precepts, and I'll review the other four that I have never, nor will I ever perfectly keep. And I think that's probably true for most of us. And not to see that as a failure, but just as the complexity of that precept. Um, the five precepts, the five lay precepts that most of us talk about: non-harming, not taking what is not free, taking what is not freely given, avoiding sexual misconduct, refraining from harmful speech, and avoiding intoxicants that cloud the mind. Now, remember, these are not commandments handed down from some mountain. No one's keeping score. There's no ledger tallying whether we're obeying them or not. There's no displeasure we're going to incur from some outside force. I'm certainly not going to be the arbiter of that. And in Buddhism, these precepts and the many others, the monks have hundreds. They weren't received. They weren't received from a mountaintop. They were observed. A person 26 centuries ago was paying very close attention, as you know, to how suffering works, and he noticed the role that carelessness plays in producing suffering, and incorporated that into one of his precepts. And and the whole authority behind the five precepts is that they're not commandments. They're better understood as points of departure for our own inquiry rather than as rigid boundaries or rigid fences. They are aspirations, they are intentions, they are a direction we face, not a line we stand behind. Okay. And I find this far more usable, far more appealing. I was never a fan of sort of the rigid, rule-based faith traditions, which, if you break a rule, you're in all kinds of trouble and have all kinds of terrible consequences. Because the moment I start asking myself, did I break a rule? It's just not helpful. I can start asking the question that actually helps, which is this action skillful or unskillful? Does it move me toward greater suffering, or does it move me toward greater freedom? And what we find with the precepts is that when we hold them as aspirations, each one opens up. The precept about not taking what isn't given stops being about just not stealing, and also becomes a reminder, like from the fire engine, um, a reminder to be generous. And then that same one about not taking what's not freely given becomes a question about our environmental footprint, our consumption, what we take from the common good without asking. These are the kinds of more subtle inquiries that come from really doing a deep dive into the precepts. And for example, the precept about intoxicants stops being just about don't get drunk and becomes a call to show up for people who might be struggling with addiction. So each of the precepts has a positive face and a negative face. The negative face might say what to refrain from, but the positive face tells us what to do on what's the positive action. People often hear the term karma associated with Buddhism and think it has something to do with the supernatural and reincarnation, but I've always approached it more plainly. From the simple adage of "as you sow, so shall you reap." That our actions have consequences, cause and effect. Things come back. Many of these consequences land on us when we engage in unskillful action. So it costs us to maintain unskillful actions. We have to justify it. There's a lot of mental activity, mental gymnastics that justify unskillful actions. That internal legal brief that we're constantly having to file and update, so that we can justify things that probably we would rather not engage in or engage in, and then have to excuse. The energy, and I've talked about this in my own life, the energy spent managing a version of ourselves we don't quite believe in. One of the things I discovered when I stopped projecting on everyone else blame for my being a difficult person was all the mental energy and the gymnastics I had to go to keep that facade up. And it's exhausting. Mark Twain put it best. He said, if you tell the truth, you don't have to remember anything. You have to go back and remember, what did I say to that person about this, that, or the other? This is not mysticism. This is just what happens. We refrain from harm not because we fear going to hell, not because we fear punishment, not because we're angling for a reward, but because harm hinders us on our path. It clutters our minds we're trying to clarify through the practice, through our sitting meditation and the like. And when we act well because acting well makes the path much smoother, much more passable. And this is all of us. This is all of us. This is, you know, I find this really freeing, really bracing. It's where I have to be straight with you. This precept leads, though I will tell you, directly into tricky waters, and that's what I meant at the outset when I said it's one none of us can keep perfectly or do 100%. Anyone that tells you otherwise about doing no harm is selling you something. In the recording teachings, the prohibition on intentionally killing an intimate being is given without exception. No footnotes. But realistically, is it really that black and white? What about self-defense if you're being, if a grizzly bear's charging you and you have a weapon? What about violence that prevents greater violence? You hear these examples like, would you kill one person to save 25 other lives? What about abortion? What about capital punishment? What about assisted dying? What about as I just said, the choice to let one die so that 50 might live? I mean, this is hardly a black and white precept. What about eating meat from factory farms and slaughterhouses? And widen that out, because harm isn't only what we do with our hands. Are we practicing non-harming if we tolerate homelessness in our cities, human trafficking, child abuse, elder abuse, domestic violence that we know is maybe going on down our street? These are not easy questions. And believe me, I do not have easy answers. I struggle with these questions. But what they remind us is, in our tradition, ethics is centered on intention. That's how we come at these difficult questions. Because the understanding that I've embraced, and I think many scholars over the centuries, I've borrowed this from them, is it is the acts where we intend to harm that violate the precept, that do damage, not the accidental, the unintended, the unpreventable. If I'm walking down the street with my dogs and step on an ant, and kill it, I am obviously engaged in harming behavior, but it was completely unintended. We are not required to flagellate ourselves over the moth that hits our windshield driving down the road, or as I said, the ant on the sidewalk. But that leaves a lot of other stuff. Because intention isn't only what I mean in this moment, it's also what I choose not to look at. I turn away from. Okay. Is that a form of harmful behavior? So I want to bring this down to something very concrete, and I'll use the example that has occupied me the most in the last 30 or so years. And it has to do with our treatment of animals. And please don't hear this as a guilt trip, but I feel it's important to address it. It's been a struggle in my own life. Now, full disclosure, I've been a vegetarian for over 30 years for both moral and aesthetic reasons. And it shapes what I see. But I'm not vegan. I eat dairy. I eat eggs, both of which are often obtained in horrific conditions for those creatures. I wear leather. Is that not hypocritical? And I'm not trying to convert you to vegetarianism here. I'm just saying that it's a complicated challenge. People have to eat protein for health reasons. The Tibetan monastics eat meat because at that altitude, crops don't grow in Tibet. I mean, how does that adhere to that if you take that precept rigidly? The early texts themselves, other than the one I quoted, aren't decisive on this because they require us to struggle with these questions. No one is going to make it easy for us unless we, subscribe to some outside authority. Only we can work out our own answers. But I want to this morning name the mechanism because it's the same mechanism at work in every hard ethical question in our lives when we're on this path. It gives us a tremendous amount of responsibility to address these thoughtfully and with clarity of mind. Some of you know Mathieu Ricard. He's the French monk, Buddhist monk. And he writes that most animal suffering, he's a real advocate for animal rights. Most animal suffering runs on a simple principle: out of sight, out of mind. It isn't that we've considered the laying hen in her cage too small to turn around with her beak trimmed to stop mutilating herself and reach the conclusion. It's that we've never arranged never to think about it at all. And I'll indict myself here. I don't sit down and have scrambled eggs and think about how they got there in my refrigerator. But I abhor those practices if I step back from it. I don't want to see the photographs. I don't want to read the descriptions of what they go through. But I eat eggs every day, or not every day, every other day. And, does buying so called cage free eggs change the arithmetic? Maybe. I don't know. Am I a hypocrite? Maybe. I don't know. I struggle with these questions. But the point of this whole example that I'm sharing with you is because it shows us the complexity of trying to do no harm. And I raise it with you not to be preachy, not to be, moralistic, because I think the struggle is our practice. It is the practice in regard to this precept, but in so many other areas of our lives. The alternative, though, resolving our discomfort by refusing to look at the suffering, is, I think, the thing that really costs us. And I speak of that personally. So the invitation is not a rule. It's not a rigid rule. Okay. It's a capacity. It's a question. Can I turn toward what is painful? Remember, the Buddha said, look at everything. Welcome all experience. Don't look away. Don't push away. Can we keep the inquiry open rather than closing it for our own comfort? Now, keep in mind that the emphasis runs in both directions. Okay. The instruction is to intend harm neither to myself nor to others, to either myself or others. Okay. And then to positively intend to act in ways that benefit myself, to benefit others, to ideally benefit the whole world. The harshness we turn on ourselves over these inconsistencies is also covered by this precept. Is that not a form of harm? When I beat myself up for being possibly being a hypocrite, because I'm bringing that judgmental stance to myself. Okay. Now, here's a distinction worth thinking about in this larger context. Okay. The quote is, mercy is the fruit of compassion. Okay. Compassion that stays a feeling is only half grown. Okay. The compassion this path asks of us is the kind that leads to action, that compels us to do something that reduces someone else's suffering. We can't cover it all. We can't cover all the nuances, all the possibilities. But I'd like you to think about this going forward from today. Pick one place where there's potential harm or perceived harm that we've chosen not to look at. It doesn't have to be animals. It might be a family member. It might be a habit, a purchase, something not good for the environment, a person that we don't want to look at because they're sleeping on the street, whatever. And just look it in the eye, whether literally or figuratively, for 30 seconds without coming to any conclusion. And then ask what small action might reduce the harm there. Now, remember, we have to be realistic about what any of us can do individually. So I don't want to feel like you load yourself up here. The following this path doesn't put us in a box or wall us off from the world. Okay. It asks us to engage in the world as best we can as a force from good, to do no harm as best we can. Remember, this path, I think, is a very forgiving path. It allows us to do things less than perfect, obviously. And it's easy in some respects, but it's extremely difficult in others. And I think that just the whole theme today is just how difficult it is. But we want to keep in the forefront this notion, this intention, when we can, to do no harm, knowing with mercy toward ourselves, knowing with forgiveness, with self compassion, that we're still going to do harm, both intentionally and unintentionally, which is why I said at the beginning, this is one precept none of us can keep. We can do our best, but we cannot at the end of the day completely avoid doing harm. So, those are my thoughts this morning on that first precept. Let us talk about it.